Welcome to episode number 3 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Emma Smithwick. Emma is a writer and former television producer with almost 20 years' experience in the industry. She spent 6 years at the BBC. She worked as a producer, a commissioning editor, and then a staff writer before going on to showrun a popular soap on Channel 4. In 2018, she launched her own production company and developed and produced shows for domestic and international audiences. Thanks to her master's in Jungian Studies, Emma is now combining her years of industry experience with depth psychology to explore the ways in which we might access and animate and amplify our creative impulses. Emma has a belief that everyone has a deep creative well and that it can transform their lives if they know how to draw from it. So this episode was truly a gem, as is Emma. She has some really fantastic insights in this about death, about grief, about creativity, and about transformation. And often she draws from her personal experiences and articulates it in a way that I think is, really important when we're talking about these kind of ideas. To realize that, people live these ideas and you can live these ideas, and it's often the way that life unfolds that brings them forth into existence for you. She's an absolute gem of a human being. I really hope you enjoy listening to this as much as I enjoyed making this episode. So here we go. Without any more wait, Emma Smithwick. Emma Smithwick, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, you once said, if the writer comes alive when they are telling that story, then you can be pretty sure if you are getting excited about it, then the audience will too.
Where did you dig that out from?
That was from an interview with Fireside Cinema. Probably about, I think it was like 8 years ago. So, is that still true in the current culture of television?
Good question. And I love that you've really gone deep on your research. Is that true in the current culture of television?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I believe that it is for sure. But then again, as you well know, I have gravitated towards a Jungian way of thinking. So I very much believe that if you resonate with something, then there might be something pretty both universal and specific to that. And so I'm a big believer in that, in listening and paying attention to that resonance. But at the moment, and I'm currently a TV writer and a former producer, I'm not sure that the current climate affords the artistic encounter that I think I was talking about in that particular interview. So, and I think that gets to the heart of what I see as maybe being the problem currently with TV. I mean, listen, it's a much bigger question and we could do an entire podcast just on that alone. But yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, and I don't know if you remember this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when Jung talks about his time in India, when he goes to the temple, the stupas of Sanchi, and he talks about that moment where he knew something was up. He knew there was something in his unconscious that was resonating with what he was seeing in the stupa. And so I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer in paying attention to that resonance because there's something there. You might not consciously understand what it is, but the better you get at paying attention to it and attuning to that, I think the better the art, the better the output, the more universal it becomes. So even if there's intense specificity to what you're writing about, in the specificity comes the universal. Um, but it's all about that attunement and listening to what I understand as being that still small voice, which I think Jung became an absolute master at listening to and acting on and integrating into his entire work. Does that answer your question? I don't know if it does.
It does answer the question. So you're kind of talking about, in some sense, this balance between the archetypal and the personal.
Mm,
Just before we move on to sort of you and your journey, so to speak, do you think, with the current climate of sort of television, dare I say, and I don't like the word, but content, um, do you think there is given that the unconscious, the sort of source of creativity, is compensatory, do you think there is a natural pushback from the unconscious that we are seeing at certain areas, in certain shows, in certain formats, anywhere in the culture of kind of visual media? Do you think that is happening as a kind of response to maybe some of these more de-sold
mm,
elements of creativity, like, two screen viewing and kind
mm.
of algorithms, and what sells and what gets numbers, but maybe doesn't touch the soul, to get woo woo about it in the same way?
Listen, I'm all for the woo woo. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I suppose the two screen viewing aspect kind of complicates things. Or the two screen viewing, which I presume you're talking about, the idea that you might be watching something on one screen and then you're also distractedly scrolling on another. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
yeah, and how, at least, although I know it hasn't been sort of explicitly said by any Netflix. I know there was an interview with a higher up at Netflix who kind of alluded to that they do take that into account. So they didn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily directly say that that is what they aim to do, but it's definitely considered when they sort of are in that kind of development stage and pre-production, and
Mm-hmm.
even, I guess, production stage. At every stage of the production, that is taken into account.
Well, when I think about things that have been really successful recently, particularly the breakout hits that no one would have predicted. So thinking about Richard Gadd's Baby Reindeer or The Bear on FX, these were wild hits for Netflix and FX. And actually, I would find it difficult to believe that there was a lot of two screen viewing going on. And I think the potency of the authorship with which those two shows were written, those two shows were not written with an algorithmic overlord in mind. I really don't believe. I think they, certainly Richard Gadd's story was, it was so, it was his truth in presented in the most raw and unfiltered way. And I think that that speaks to the fact that we are really, in spite of ourselves, very often we, as the collective audience, are really hungry for that deep truth, that deep resonance that maybe our unconscious might have with his unconscious in that encounter with his show. Now, listen, I could be wrong. I don't know what the statistics are for the two screen viewing, but I think the two screen viewing might come more when there are shows that are designed with with the algorithm in mind. They're kind of formulaic, which automatically negates this raw truth that could come through. So, but The Bear is just an amazing show, and it's ultimately all about grief. It's the anatomy of grief writ large, but also in the specificity of that very particular character in that time and place. So yeah, I think if you look at those bigger, huge juggernaut of shows that are quite formulaic, and they do really well, and they really serve a function. If the function is um, avoiding intimacy and actually inviting this idea of like constant numbing, because actually the intimacy of a Richard Gad show um, is too much to hold. Um, so I think the two screen viewing, the impulse to be distracted is part of our greater fear of emotional intimacy that we're just not currently set up to encounter in our current cultural paradigm.
So they kind of play into those two screen kind of shows, play into the sort of our complexes, our, in the sense that when we try and avoid the things that maybe come up that
Mm.
we are that we react to, and these shows like The Bear and like Baby Reindeer kind
Mm.
of appeal to that deeper sense, maybe that capital S self, that creative, human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hopeful message, Emma. That's
Is it?
good.
Oh,
I
good.
mean, we're a short way into this and we're already getting some hopeful messages out. So that is good. Okay. All right.
Good.
Brilliant. So tell me a little bit about your story in the sense of your personal myth. Okay. So I keep coming back to this on the show with various guests, and I'm always intrigued in a Jungian sense of how people recognize their personal myth,
Mm.
how that has come up in their life, and how they are maybe living in it now.
Mm.
And the way I like to think about it, I always refer to this Susan Rowland quote, where she talks about how one of the elements you could think of with personal myth is this kind of repetition with a difference, right? And it's kind of linking to what you were saying there about what makes those shows good. There are these archetypal themes, these sort of rooted um, patterns that we sort of know and connect with us on an emotional level, on a real tangible level, tied in with the kind of historical particularities of a place, time,
Mm.
personal experience, right?
Mm.
So, how do you feel that your personal myth? How have you noticed it? Have you noticed it? How
Mm.
do you feel that the archetypal themes that kind of run through your life have maybe reappeared with a different dress, a different historical particularity at various points in your life?
Hell of a question. Jesus, you're not pulling any punches, are you?
We go straight in here, straight in.
Um, mm. I mean, of course, now I've got the benefit of hindsight. I'm now 44, so there's plenty of life to look back on and to pull out those threads. But I for sure didn't, in the moment, know that those moments were the moments. Um, okay, well, so I'm reminded of a poem by Seamus Heaney, which is called The Diviner. And in it, there's a line that says, the pluck came sharp as a sting. And I'm using that, I almost use that from my creative practice as a way, as I kind of previously just talked about, as a way to understand those moments as like, oh, pay attention. Here comes the pluck sharp as a sting. Something's happening here. And I suppose that's how I would, looking back along the kind of catalogue of past experiences, that was true in all of those moments where I think my personal myth was trying to punch through. And I would say I'm really fortunate in that those moments, whilst they might be, dressed as ostensibly as tragedy or as, as death or grief or whatever, actually there was that moment of, here's an opportunity. What are you going to do with it? But my biography is littered with moments where I didn't pay attention to that. So, for example, when I was, so I did law as my undergrad, and I was going to go that direction because it was definitely this very deeply entrenched trying to please my dad, age-old daddy story, whatever. But I was like, oh, that's how I'll get approval. And I went down that path, and I worked for a firm in Paris because I did law in French, and I remember doing contracts for a French filmmaker. It was Luc Besson at the time, and I was like such a big fan of his work. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm on the wrong side of the contract. But even then, I didn't really pay attention. I was just like, nope, it's this path. I'm going this way. And then I was really fortunate in that I continued doing my law finals and went on that track, still with the mind that I was going to follow my dad into his legal practice and go that route, even though, honest to God, it bored me senseless, and I found nothing of value in it. It works for a lot of people. There are a lot of very satisfied lawyers out there. I was not one of them. And I then I was very, very fortunate to go and work to do kind of legal work for a film studio afterwards. And I had this very fortuitous meeting with a producer who actually said, do you want to come and work on the other side in production? So I took that opportunity straight away. And that then led me very convoluted route, but I ended up working for the BBC in London. And then I went on to work for a flagship show on Channel 4, which was Hollyoaks, which is a big continuing drama. They like to say continuing drama, like it's a soap. Anyway, I remember being I was going to an awards show, the National Television Awards, and I was going with all the cast. And it was very fancy, and I had gotten like a new outfit and getting ready with the cast and getting hair and makeup done. And then we went in, a car together and getting out on the red carpet. And I remember walking with shoes that I bought that morning. I'd gone to Selfridges and I'd bought these I can't believe I'm saying this on a podcast, but anyway, I went and bought these Louboutins. And I remember thinking years before, when I get my Louboutins, I will have made it. That's a sign to me. When I have those red soles, I will, I'll know.
The magical object.
Right. And I remember vividly walking down that carpet with all the A-listers and being in the middle of it, and all the paparazzi and all the bulbs, whatever, flashing. And I was in this like sparkly gold dress. And honest to God, I was just walking down and I was like, this is not it. Holy shit, this is not it. What have you been doing? With every painful foot in front of the other, I was just like, this is a load of bollocks. Sorry, I don't even know if I can swear, but anyway, there it is. But
it's allowed.
But that moment of not that the artistic pursuit of of acting and producing and writing, like those are all so valid, but it wasn't for me. That kind of limelight, that fame, that success, that whatever it was in that moment wasn't chiming with me. Something was really discordant. And I remember thinking, how am I so unhappy in this moment where everyone's telling me, oh, you've reached it, you've done it, you've made it. Because I was producing that show, and we were on our way to awards and all this stuff. But I still ignored it. Even though I had that data set that was really clear to me, and I just kind of ignored it, and I just continued on. And it wasn't until COVID, because I then went up and set up my own company. This whole time, like striving, the cult of busyness. I had this really flash office in London, and we had investors, and I was doing all the things, and we were getting commissions, and I was just like, I was like a headless chicken, but I was getting a lot of praise for that. The investors were really happy. There was just this constant feedback loop that this was what it was all about. But yet inside, more and more, I just felt so hollow. And I understand that that's, a lot of people might hear that and think, you had such privilege. Like, how were you not enjoying that at the moment? I think that's it. Because I was so detached from my actual purpose, and my own rhythms, and I was blocking it out with this the cult of busy, and this kind of constant striving, and I was never still, never ever still. I was definitely indoctrinated with this idea of productivity. I think like work is close to godliness. This idea was very deep in my own kind of family culture, and also just culture writ large actually. And it took COVID for everything to stop. And suddenly, and we had just shot something. We just shot a show for Channel 4. And I remember everything just kind of stopped and everything was paused. And I was just sitting on the sofa with my husband. It was a weekend and we were watching a film. And I remember looking at him completely like man sprawled across the sofa, like having absolutely no hesitation with relaxing. And my form of relaxing was sitting on the very edge of the sofa with my heels up off the ground and my legs both kind of twitching. And I was kind of like, my entire body was so rigid and tight. And yet we were watching like some film on a Saturday night, having a nice time. And I was just like, whoa, it was just getting this moment of, what is this? This isn't, I'm not relaxed. And I then started to understand the hypervigilance with which I was living in this kind of fight or flight state. And because I was also writing drama at the time, I was really interested in psychology just because that's what I was doing. And one of the main preoccupations I had in all of the shows I was attracted to writing or producing was this constant question of, why do hurt people hurt people? And that kind of formed the pulse, the creative pulse underneath everything. And so that led me then, I had this time in COVID suddenly, and I was like, okay, well, I started reading Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine. I was really drawn to all the traumatologists and this understanding of what hypervigilance might be and what it might link to. But I then still didn't really pay heed, and I was still dead set on, once COVID ended, it was getting the company back on track and still going at 90 miles an hour. But something had shifted, very definitely. The stillness that was enforced definitely started to shift things. And I also turned 40 in the pandemic. And again, I think I'm a big, I really subscribe to Jung's idea that, life starts at 40. Everything beforehand is research. And then honestly, it was... I decided to do neuroscience. I did just as like a kind of side hustle, I decided to go to do a master's and MSc in neuroscience, because I was like, if I'm going to be doing all these shows that are dealing with like really big traumas and drama and the intricacies of the human condition, I kind of need to stop being a pseudo psychologist, and I need to actually get some qualifications. And so I went into a program called Neuroscience and Psychology of Mental Health at King's in London, and it was amazing. I loved it. But then, and I really again subscribe to this idea of the pedagogy of interruption, those moments where you're just forced to just down tools and attend to something else. And in the rupture might come something of real value. And that rupture was my dad, who got a very quick diagnosis and a pretty severe, he was given like 6 months to a year. And I was with him with the oncologist. But the thing was, my dad and I had a really, really difficult relationship. In fact, we'd been estranged for quite a long time until that moment. And it took that moment. I mean, nothing changed immediately because I was, I was very practical at the time. I was really, I was really assessing our relationship, and I thought, well, how much does a cancer diagnosis change my relationship with him? He's still the man I've known for, whatever it was, 41 years, and yet I knew that as his firstborn and as a dutiful daughter, I was going to attend to him in as much as I could, and that was really difficult because he went downhill really quickly. But God, I hope this isn't too. I'm really circumambulating your question.
We're all for the circumambulation. You circumambulate away.
Okay, I don't know if you subscribe to the CNET route, but this is where you're being taken. Um, but then what happened was I found that very difficult, actually, being up close and personal with him in his time of great distress. You know, my dad really had um, lived a life of apparent fearlessness, and he had really body slammed life. And he was, in every room, for better or for worse, he took up a lot of oxygen, and I found it very difficult then to be around him. And I remember he got palliative care team at home, and they were just extraordinary. And he was able to be comfortable as much as he could at home. But there was this moment about, well, I can say in hindsight, it was 3 days before he died, but at the time we didn't know he was due to go a lot longer. And I had this feeling, I was having a very difficult time with him. I was leaving his bedside almost every time in tears, and just coming up against all our stuff just sat heavily between us. And he was getting angry with me. I was getting angry at him. I had this just constant feeling of like the weight of disappointment, and the weight of, I suppose now I understand it as a kind of pre-grieving. But anyway, I had this bizarre, it wasn't even a voice, it wasn't articulate. It was just this knowing that I had to get into my car and drive 4.5 hours across the country to go to my favorite beach in West Cork. I don't know what, it didn't make sense to anybody, because I was going to be gone for 48 hours, or the guts of, and people advised me not to go. They were like, you should really stay here. And I was just like, I can't. And where my dad lived was, it was inland, and it was really flat, and it's not where we grew up, but it was where he ended up. And I just felt so completely uninspired by the landscape. And every time I'd go outside for a walk to try and get a breather, try to rejuvenate, I couldn't get anything. So I got in my car and I drove down to this amazing beach called Barley Cove. And on that beach, I just sat for hours. And there was something that I was intuiting, that I needed to go and sit and literally situate myself into deep time. There was something about the landscape there that was so elemental, was so rugged, was just so ancient. And sitting there, watching the tides come in and out, and reading, I happened to have a book by John O'Donoghue, who's this wonderful Irish poet, and he's a former priest, he's a philosopher, he's just an incredibly beautiful man. And I was reading his book at the time, and I suddenly had this realization. I remember like toying with a grain of sand, and I was just toying with this grain of sand, and it occurred to me that was the size of the beef I had with my dad. Like all the stuff, all the 41 years worth of hurt and feeling of abandonment and disappointment and neglect and whatever. I was like, it's that size. In this universe, this is really how small this is. It's pretty insignificant. And in that moment, I actually got up and I stayed overnight there. And the first thing in the morning, I went straight back to my dad's bedside. And by the time I did, he had lost the power of speech, and he could hardly move, and he had really accelerated, his downfall. He was so emaciated and no longer eating, whatever. But I remember crossing the threshold into his bedroom, and it was like my ego had had a tranquilizer dart, because something happened when I walked over and I went into his bedroom. The space felt different. And I just sat down beside him and I just said, Dad, I really love you, don't you? And his entire frame, his tiny, tiny skeleton just took this huge breath, and he made this noise. And I just kind of couldn't comprehend what was going on. But I knew he'd heard me. And actually at that moment, I thought, I think this might be the first and only time my dad's actually heard those words and believed them. Because my dad hasn't been short of people loving him, but I don't think he's ever received it. Anyway, very quickly afterwards, he continued to go downhill, and we had a priest came to visit him unexpectedly. Actually, he dropped in, And he gave my dad this blessing, and he said, "Oh, Paul, you're so beautiful." And I remember standing at the bedside being like, okay, my dad's a lot of things, but I wouldn't have said beautiful. And I was kind of like, what's this guy on? But there was something about that word. It's like the priest, this beautiful, beautiful man, had lent me his lens. And through that word, beautiful almost became a new framework. And I then looked at my dad and I was like, oh my God, he is beautiful. And there was something that happened where I was seeing the father that wasn't there, the father that didn't show up. I was seeing the negation of who he was, rather than actually seeing Paul Smithwick, the man who just the man, not the father who hadn't been. And in that moment, in his naked humanity, I saw this undeniable beauty. And the priest then left. And as he was leaving, I went up to my dad and I was standing beside him and I just shouted. I was like, please don't go. And everyone in the room my sister was there and my aunt was there, and everyone was a bit like, the lack of decorum from me, this kind of bleating banshee. And this lovely man came back and said, oh, no, this is normal. Once patients get a blessing, they actually go into a deep sleep because they've got some sort of peace. And I was like, no. And there was something, there was like an electrical charge in my chest. I can't describe it any more than that. It was just this, it's like my body was like this antenna. And I was like, no, he's leaving. He is leaving his body. And the priest came back to the end of the bed, and my sister and my sister was already very close. My aunt got closer. And sure enough, we just all stayed really silent, and his breathing was more labored. And then I just leaned down to my dad. And I certainly wasn't spiritual to that point. I was a very lapsed Catholic. But I just leant down to my dad and I just said, I know you can see them. Go towards them. And I was talking about my two younger brothers who died a long time ago and my grandmother. And with that, he just took his last breath and he left. And at the moment of departure, it's like this, when people say that the cosmic egg cracks, that's the best way I can describe what happened. It was like in this moment, time collapsed in on itself. And I felt, and I know this is going to sound bonkers, I told you I'm up for the woo-woo, but don't forget, I was legally trained and I was doing neuroscience. I was heavily invested in the materialist paradigm. And in that moment, I felt like that my dad and I were kind of conjoined. And it's almost like the rhythms I had perceived, that my body had understood whilst I was in deep time, those ancient rhythms. It's like I found my way into my dad's biorhythms in that small window we had before he died. And then when he did leave, it was like it all made sense to me. Even though I can't really articulate it now. So that was the moment where it was this rupture of moment of it challenged everything I ever knew and also corroborated something really deep and instinctual. But my intuition to go 4.5 hours journey to just sit on a beach, it felt like, okay, there's something to this. And that opened up more questions than it answered, for sure. And those questions are still open. But the difference is, I think now I'm okay with unanswered questions. And actually, I'm okay with just living those questions, as opposed to beforehand, I was desperate for answers. Uncertainty was a scary place. And I was doing everything I could to put certainty around me and to deal with things that were that was measurable. And yeah, anyway, listen, Chris, I've gone on so long, but that I think it bespeaks the personal myth, the emergence of the personal myth, that I understand the personal myth to be that you can resist it all you like, but it's coming for you. And and I was very, very fortunate, and I'll forever be grateful for the best gift my dad ever gave me, which was allowing me to accompany him to, to wherever he's gone. I went as far as I could with him.
Wow. I mean, I do just want to like take a beat, because it really is a beautiful story. It touches on so many different elements. There's this sort of intrinsic connecting of everything, and I'm very grateful that you shared that. Some of the things that come to mind for me, this idea, firstly, that you were kind of beckoned to take that drive to that beach by something. You said it wasn't like a voice, it wasn't like words, it was a knowing, this kind of ineffable feeling to go there. And then when you're talking about your experience at that beach, I automatically thought of Jung talking about this idea of how geographically, and I should say he talks about this for like a paragraph in the collected works, and then he writes about it for a couple of lines in a letter. Then he never touches on this again properly. But he talks about the idea of archetypes. I think at the time of writing, he's calling it spirit, the spirit of something. I'm not sure if he's quite using the term archetype as regularly. I might be wrong. But he talks about how, in effect, archetypes could be bound geographically to a place. He uses the example of America and how they have something to perhaps consider in that they sort of invaded a land, maybe decimated a people, and the spirit of that people perhaps still exists in that land, and it's coming up into people that should not be there, physical bodies that maybe should not be there. Now that's the example he uses, but it just made me think in terms of, you were talking about you couldn't kind of get what you needed. You couldn't find that space in that area, that geographical place where your father lived, and you needed to go somewhere else, and something beckoned to you to go there. And then when you got there, this sort of collapsing of time, it starts to feel very in line with Jung's idea of the unus mundus, this one world, beckoning you to see that. And as the story continues, and you go back and you see your father, who can no longer speak, phenomenologically, I thought it was beautiful in the sense that with Jungian ideas, phenomenologically, draw from Roger Brooke here, his idea is that the complex frames the world. It reveals the world to us. Our experience of people is shaped as a result of our complexes, and it sounds like in that moment those complexes around your father collapsed, and there was just this moment without that projection of any sort of archetypal expectation, maybe, and just this kind of present. And then again it comes back. You said you felt this almost union with your father, and again it's that one world, this idea that Jung had of the unus mundus, and how maybe the world isn't this sort of Cartesian split of material and spirit, and it's this one kind of whole thing. Really, really beautiful. And I thank you for sharing that, Emma, because it's a cool story, and led you to want to pivot again in study? And that's in part, I guess it led you, am I right in saying that, to how we met, I guess, which was
Mm,
through our study of Jung.
mm.
Tell me a little bit more about the alchemical um, phrase that came up.
Oh wow.
You haven't mentioned it in this,
Mm,
but I know of it
mm,
from our previous conversations, and I think that's quite interesting as well. So
mm.
tell me a little bit, just briefly touch on that.
Okay. And also I should say, Chris, thank you for listening to my story. And I think active listening is such a rare thing these days. So I'm really grateful that you had very open ears to hear it, because not everyone can. So I appreciate that. Um, yeah. Okay. So the alchemical. So well, and I know you said briefly, but let me just preface it with what happened in between my dad's death and then um, that alchemical moment. So 3 months after my dad died, my mum, who was extremely healthy at the time, incredibly competent, very independent, she had a full blown brain hemorrhage. And her and my dad had actually been estranged for quite a long time. But she was on her way in, she was on a bus on her way into her third ever therapy session that had been very much encouraged by me. So but I'll leave that to the side. Anyway, and on that bus, her therapist at the time had given her. She was a psychotherapist, but she had given her some homework, and the homework was an article written by. It was an interview between Daniela Seif and Donald Kalshed, and it was about the nature of trauma. And again, I was still in my, whilst Jung had very much been on my radar, he'd been on my radar since I was about 17, 18. I was still in this, I was at the time, I remember I was writing a paper on molecular biology. I was still in that neuroscience mode. But there was something so Mum was on the bus and she was reading that article when, the banks of her brain burst effectively, and her brain was flooded, and she was rendered. Disoriented doesn't even begin to describe the level of stroke she was having and what happened. Anyway, very, very, very grateful that she not only came through it, but honestly, and Mum and I talked about this the other day, and she's okay with me sharing this, by the way. Both her and I agree that it is one of the best things that ever happened to her, because her personality, now she had a massive personality shift, but it wasn't like she changed personality. It was like the excess, the superfluous, accumulated material from her cultural conditioning had just been obliterated. And I remember going to see her in the hospital and her hugging me. And Mum and I have always had like an amazing relationship, but she hugged me in a full body way. Like she was totally there. There was no self-consciousness. There was no stiffness. It was just this, and that took a while because she was in a very fragile state for a couple of weeks afterwards. But when she could sit up in bed and hug, I was just like, holy shit, who is this? It was just, and that has continued to unfold. It's almost like the fragmented personalities that pre-existed the stroke. It's like the stroke actually brought all the important ones around the table and got rid of the more counterfeit sides of personality. But so that happened, and that really, for me, was the moment where I was like, "Huh." I mean, this neuroscience, I was really enjoying it, but I was like, it feels like there's more going on. And because when I was talking to her neurologist, the neurologist was effectively describing what was happening without going. It felt like topsoil. Honestly, is how it felt. And I was looking at the brain scans and I was talking to the neurologist, but I was like, this isn't explaining the connections that I feel might be there that we're not talking about. And so I definitely had this feeling of like, what's at the taproot? And then a few months later, only a couple of months actually, I was writing. So I was still doing my TV writing, and I had several contracts with a studio in LA. And then the writers' strike happened, and I thought I was going to be. I thought I actually just didn't. I wasn't really au fait with what was going to happen and what the implications for that were. And I had been really smug, honestly, about thinking, oh, I'm working with the US. That's like, it felt like, I don't know, it just felt like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is success. And overnight, all my contracts were paused, and suddenly money that was due to come in, that was kind of, to like my salary for the following year, everything just dried up overnight. And I hurtled into this state of panic. But a few days into it, whilst I was navigating this panic, thanks to, again, this kind of weird knowing, this weird sense of, you're going to be okay. Actually, you've got this. This is the way it's supposed to be. And I didn't really lean into I didn't let the full panic consume me. And I was kind of bizarrely walking this line of like, there's something here for me. This is telling me something. And I woke up one morning from a deep dream. I woke up to this voice, and it wasn't mine. There was a voice that was just saying, albedo, albedo, albedo. And I woke up and I was like, huh? The word didn't mean anything to me. I had worked on a TV show like 10 years previously that had a spaceship called albedo. That's as much as I knew. I had sci-fi associations. And it just kept rolling around in my head. And I just went on with my day. And I didn't think much of it. But it just kept repeating in my head like this insufferable echo. And I then decided, okay, I'm just going to look it up. And then I looked it up. And it brought me down this whole rabbit hole that I think I'm still in. And that rabbit hole turned into this kind of subterranean labyrinth that I'm now in, which was opening me up to Jung and his theories around alchemy and the 4 stages of alchemy. And I felt like the nigredo, the albedo, the citrinitas, and the rubedo, I started to see them as not linear processes, but actually, as with so much of Jung, this circularity, and you've mentioned it before, the unus mundus, but that actually salvation doesn't come from certainly the tradition that I've been brought up in, the Judeo-Christian traditions of like, it's a linear journey and that salvation comes at the end of it. Actually, this idea of the way out is to just keep journeying the circle. And I didn't think I was in albedo, but I certainly understood that albedo, this idea of, enlightenment, for want of a better, less grandiose word, but that, that some sort of awakening, some sort of seeing the light was now a firm aspiration, which it hadn't been for me because I didn't really know what that was beforehand. So so I think that's what you're talking about.
Yes. Again, I'm taking a beat. It seems that there are these. We started talking about the personal myth. Where does the archetypal intersect with the personal and come up in your life? And in those stories, there does seem to be these themes of the unconscious kind of piercing your reality, be it psychologically, be it sort of materially through world and the events and the people around you, to kind of bring that light, that kind of awakening to something. And one of the things I was thinking, just to briefly go back to it, with your mum, bless her, and her stroke, was this idea that Jung talks about in Memories, Dreams, reflections of defoliation. So when he has his heart issues, and he becomes very unwell, and he really experiences the sort of fragility of his body in his older age. And I urge people to go and look it up. But he uses an analogy of, I think, a tree and defoliation to describe what he felt like he was experiencing. And he came to the conclusion that he thought that experience was, as a result of it, he had these kind of visionary experiences that made him feel like he was connected again to this one world, this unus mundus idea that he'd been kind of thinking about. And yeah, it seems like that experience that your mum may have had, I'm not trying to sort of project this onto her experience, but it seems like a form of defoliation by Jung's definition, this sort of encounter with your physical fragility, and then this kind of psychological breaking down of maybe structures that have, again, framed your world and sort of shaped your existence and interactions, and the kind of burning off, if we're thinking alchemically, this burning off of the kind of dead wood, the stuff that no longer serves, and yeah, is no longer fit for purpose anymore, and kind of disappears to reveal this new kind of structure of being towards the world that maybe your mum was experiencing, that allowed her to, for you to have those interactions that felt so present and sort of intertwined with that kind of unified reality, right? Similar to almost what you experienced with your father. This breaking down of structures that kind of reveal ourselves to each other, and what we know is there underneath the surface. But we kind of pretend, don't we? We pretend that we aren't just these fragile souls who ultimately just want to hug our friends, hug our family, tell everyone that we, love them deeply, and that we're all a little bit petrified and, in awe of existence. And it's all this wash of confusion. And yeah, you talk about these moments in your life where, be it events or sort of psychological happenings or engagement in active imagination with, these kind of elusive, there but not there figures in your imagination that are coming up and telling you to go to beaches and stuff, have kind of revealed this, revealed the world to you, and not just in a moment. They've sort of led you to a place, it's led you to another place, and then to another place, and then they're guiding you all the way through. And I think it's a really good example of how it's important to pay attention to what comes up, so we can see the opportunities you talked about, missing opportunities perhaps sort of in the moment and only realizing it kind of retrospectively. But to see the moments where maybe reality itself, whatever that may be, don't have definitive answers, but maybe reality itself is trying to shift us, to lure us out of our disenchantment with the everyday humdrum of our existence, and reveal to us that actually the life that we sometimes think is maybe a bit mundane and a bit boring is filled with this kind of enchanted, mythical story that is in some ways more engaging than the sort of stories that you might see in television and film, because it's our story. It has the thread that binds us to our birth and possibly beyond. I don't know if that's a bit too deep, but I just think they're beautiful stories that really touch on that ineffable, unknowable nature of existence and of being. And I think a lot of the reasons why many people do find themselves gravitating towards Jung, because he was quite a pragmatic man in the way that he explained concepts. And although some of the stuff, as we've kind of said, can sometimes be a bit woo-woo to some people, he talks of it in a way that makes you buy into it and go, okay, I'm listening, because I've maybe experienced it in my life, and he writes in such a way that can make you really almost see the empirical in the woo woo at times.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, well
Yeah.
put.
So that led you to studying Jung, where we crossed paths, which was a fantastic period of my life, and I hope of yours too.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that. I want to talk more, dare I say it, more about sort of death and grief, just very briefly, because I think, we've talked about physical death. We've talked in some sense about symbolic deaths of the structures that we think are our personas, are our egos, that kind of shape how we engage with the world, and how the acceptance of allowing them to disappear can reveal something new. So I think it's a really important topic, generally, archetypically speaking, to touch on. Physical death, symbolic death, this kind of archetypal death and how it presents itself in life. What do you think, archetypically speaking, so let's say broadly speaking, with death comes grief, right? And I imagine, I've experienced loss in my life, and my personal experience is that grief is a long process, and it comes in waves, and it appears in new forms. How do you navigate and engage with grief when it comes to symbolic death, with physical death, be it the death of loved ones, be it the death of an old career, an old pathway, of a friendship, of a part of yourself? What is your relationship with that archetypal figure that kind of looms in many aspects of our lives?
I mean, I'm going to ignore when you said brief, very briefly. I mean, you keep saying this, and I'm just that is a question that the
Yeah, I'll let you
instructions are
off.
very
I
brief.
did I did expand. I did expand,
No,
and I think it would be harsh to say, all right, I'm going to turn the stand timer over now. You got 30 seconds.
yeah,
Tell me.
good with it. Yeah, hell of a process.
Yeah, you take your time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, listen, it's such a big question, and it's one that I am very much still in the process of figuring out how to. I mean, I think everybody is on some level how to navigate, because, as you say, it's universal. And the experience of loss, everyone can relate to it in some way or another. Um, and also, you did say, something you said previously. You were like, "Oh, is that too deep?" And I think, listen, you and I we've studied depth psychology for a reason. I don't think there is anywhere too deep. So
Yeah, fair point.
it's a pretty friendly space for that. Um, so I think I've understood. Well, God, there's so many ways to come at this. So I'll try and this will be a bit messy, but that's entirely indicative of how I feel grief is. As you say, it kind of comes in waves, and it has its own rhythms, and those rhythms are so specific to you. So, um, what I took from my dad's dying experience um, was that actually I had this innate facility to transmute the pain into something creative. So that's not to say I in any way minimized the pain that comes with losing a parent, regardless of your relationship. That you only lose your dad once, and for me, I was put directly in touch with my own capacity for real transformation. And I think I was, as I said before, I was very lucky in the way that it happened, in that I had these, gradual clues or nudges, or it's like destiny was kind of poking me and being like, if you keep ignoring it, it's going to get, the scale is going to increase. But even when it did have this huge rupture, it yielded untold fruit for me. And that is so I wrote the eulogy for my dad's at my dad's funeral. And in Ireland, we do things pretty quickly when it comes to the funeral. So it was like 3 days later. And I remember sitting down to write it. And my dad was beloved by many people. He was like so gregarious, so charismatic. So I knew it was going to be a bit. And in Ireland, we do death well. It's community really comes together. Again, unbelievably fortunate that there are these communal ritualistic practices that help you hold the enormity of the experience. And I remember writing, and I've called myself a writer. I've been writing on TV shows. I've been practicing writing as a professional writer for a while now. But there was something different when I wrote that eulogy, which I thought was going to be impossible. And I thought, this is when I'm going to get writer's block. And it was the complete opposite. It just came out. Somebody who was such a complicated person and so multifaceted cohered on the page so effortlessly. And in that moment, when I ostensibly was all over the place, because we were organizing funerals and we were, calling people for more, it was such a chaotic time. There was such clarity and conviction with the words I wrote down. I don't think I even did a second draft. I think it just fell onto the page in a way that was true to my experience of my dad, without mythologizing or eulogizing him in a way that would have been in any way a distortion of the truth, whilst also honoring him. But in that moment, as I was writing about him, my dad he was like an historian. An amateur historian. He archived and kept everything about our family's history. And honestly, I used to think that because he'd have paintings of like my ancestors. And I used to think it was kind of pompous, and I just was a bit like allergic to it all. And Dad would always tell us stories about those who've gone before us. And again, I thought it was this kind of grandiosity playing out. I really rejected it. So much so that I took the piss out of him with great regularity. And he did take it in very good, he received it well. He was a good sport. But when I was writing the eulogy, something crystallized that actually what my dad had been doing was a form of ancestor worship. He'd been keeping the past very much alive. And so in the interstitial space between the death and the funeral, and again, it's very ceremonial and it's very ritualistic, because we have these ancient practices that are still alive today, and they're very alive here. In that interstitial space, well, I like to think of it as, like hermit crabs. Once they've outgrown one shell, they remove it, and then they go and stand on the ocean floor beside another shell they want to move into, but they're not quite ready for it yet. So they have to wait outside until they grow big enough to take on that new shell. And that moment where they're bare, they're just on the ocean floor, and they are vulnerable to the forces at play, the currents, the predators, etc. But that is the really important part for them to grow. They need that space. They need to be exposed to the elements. That's what it felt like at that time. It was this, enormous vulnerability, openness. I was so receptive in a way that I didn't quite know how to navigate. But in writing, in that creative act of writing a eulogy, of in many ways concretizing a life, a very full life, I found in it a new portal that I had foreclosed beforehand. I had shut it down. I didn't want, that was not a route I was going to go down. I was not going to engage with my dad's seeming obsession with the past. And actually, what I found was in recognizing it and honoring it, I felt like I took an imaginary baton from my dad. And I then understood that so much of what my dad's life was about was, to some degrees, an unsuccessful metabolization of an accrued lineage that, to my understanding, elevated patriarchal forms of being. And I think my dad very much suffered under that structure, because, as you said beforehand, he couldn't recognize his own vulnerability and his own needs to be intimate and close to people, and that vulnerability is the crucible in which that's born. And I think I understood, and this is why, Jung just spoke to me so loudly here in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and actually it's littered all over his work, this relationship he had with the dead, with that which has gone before him. And actually that for him, grief was healing in motion. It was because Jung, I think, has this reverence for the past, but he has a bias for the future. He didn't get stuck there because he understood, he swam in the currents of change, and he was able to paradoxically find motion and stillness in change, in metamorphosis. Metamorphosis, I mean, literally going beyond form. He was able to come undone and reform as a continual process. And I think that's what grief is, in my understanding. Grief, it shattered the frames of my, all the frames of reference I had. But in that shattering, a bit like Harold Bloom talks about breaking the vessel. You break the vessel to put it back together in a new form, in a new way. And that's what I see now as a deeply creative endeavor. And to go back to your idea of to you quoting Jung about the tree losing the leaves, the deep winter, again, it speaks to the natural rhythms, this idea of vernalization. A lot of plants need the deep winter so that they may bear fruit. And the return, the death and then the return is the all important part. And I think that for me, in fact, it was Martha Beck who said, actually I have the quote here somewhere. Martha Beck talks about bad artists ignore the darkness of human existence. Good artists often get stuck there. Great artists embrace the full catastrophe of our condition and find beyond it an even deeper truth of peace, healing, and redemption. And for me, it feels like going to the underworld, doing the Nekia, communing with the dead, is only valuable if you can return. And so it's, again, that speaks to the cycle. And so the constant communion of death and rebirth is so important. And I can see how creatively, how generative that was for Jung. And even at the end of his life, in an MDR, when he's talking about sitting in his tower, in the round, again, this idea of circularity, being in the round and sitting and living the questions of his ancestors. And yeah, that's what brought him so much, well, I don't say so much peace, whatever peace he had towards the end of his life, it felt like that was his grief process was an inextricable part of that.
Yeah. Again, more beautiful stuff. That's a great quote I've never heard before. And thematically, it's touching on a lot of the stuff that's come up. Again, it seems your personal myth can't help but show its face. I love what you're talking about, this vulnerability in the face of kind of what grief brings up, and that willingness to go to those places, to live in the winter, to accept that it is seasonal, it is part of a process, to not avoid what that is, and to briefly bring it to myself. I knew we might discuss death in this, and because of my relationship with death, I thought I better think about this because I do ponder it from time to time. But I was like, let's get these my little ducks in a row and just what is it? What have I learned from death and grief? And it's interesting how what came up for me is very much what that quote kind of says and what you've touched on, which was I'll give you the example. Not too long ago, like a year and a half ago, maybe just over a year ago, our family dog, sadly, had to be put to sleep. He was 14 years old. He was an old boy, but he was a good boy, right? And it's obviously very sad. You go through that grief process, and this, I know for the weeks leading up when we knew it was going to have to happen, and we're sort of hanging on to hope. You're crying, and there's tears, and everyone's upset, and it's very visceral, and it's in your body, and wow. And I remember the day he'd been put to sleep, I was at the gym, and I think I was like listening to some music, probably within that tone of sadness, right? People gravitate towards sort of sad media when they are feeling sad. And I guess I'll come to maybe sort of what that does in just a moment. But yeah, I felt this obviously tremendous, like, sort of swelling of unconscious energy, this sadness and this grief sort of washed over me. And I thought in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about the dog. I loved the dog, and there was so much pain and sadness and grief there for the dog. But it was this archetypal encounter with death. It was archetypal grief, and I realized the dog passing away was simply a personal historical particularity, to take it back to what we were talking about earlier, that allowed the archetypal energy of death and grief to re-emerge from when my brother passed away when I was 14 in a car accident, unfortunately. It changed me fundamentally, and I've worked through that a lot in my life, but there is still lots to work through, as you've talked about. And the dog passing away was just opening that portal into the unconscious for that grief for my brother, and perhaps for parts of myself that I'd symbolically let go, that I knew I didn't need anymore. But you still grieve them in some way, perhaps for sort of past lovers, lost lovers, missed connections, the ones that get away, that kind of vibe, all these different types of grief and loss. The dog passing away opened up a doorway for all of that to come up. And I thought that was fascinating because it makes you realize that, you kind of touched on it on this. It's an opportunity. You're giving me an opportunity to look at this again with fresh phenomenological kind of vigor. I don't have to fake this because this is so there again. And that just is a testament to how much of a good boy little Archie the dog was, because in the same way, the gift that your father gave you in his passing, little Archie the good boy dog gave me a gift in his passing, which was, here you go, here's a real encounter with your grief of your brother and everything you've lost in life. Do you want to sit with this, or do you want to avoid it? And I sat with it, and I felt it. And I think in that feeling, in that voluntary acceptance of the things we tend to want to avoid, there is, like you've said, deep healing, deep transformation. And Jung said himself about his encounters with the unconscious over his life. He said, I thought my whole life I was trying to shape this lava. And then I realized near the end of my life that the whole time the lava had been shaping me. And I think that's what it is. You accept, you let go, you let the thing do its work. It's older than time. it's the ineffable energy of the cosmos, of everything, mystery, the mystery. And I think you have to let it do its work. And just to try and bring it back around to, I guess, creative works, one thing I found that was interesting, I said obviously it came up when I was listening to music, is when those feelings come up, when that doorway gets opened and the feelings emerge, it might be a piece of music, or it might be a scene in a TV show, or a certain film that just has that energy in it that almost acts as like a hand. It's like
Mm.
the other side of the unconscious,
Mm.
that's manifested itself through a variety of, from showrunners to DPs to producers to scriptwriters, in this collective creation of a piece of art. It's now been created. You as a person are watching it, feeling the unconscious energy of your grief or whatever it may be, your love, or all these different feelings from the other side. And then there's this connection, these two worlds becoming one. And all of a sudden, that creative work can act as like a hand
Mm.
across the divide that we think is there, to say, it's okay. Like, this is going to suck, but this piece of art is going to help you. You're going to feel this. You're going to channel that feeling into this, and it's going to help you transmute, you were saying, transmute that into your experience of watching this. And that, I think, is a beautiful thing of art that
Mm.
people make. You only have to think of, I mean, when I watched that, The Last of Us, that with Bill and Frank,
Mhm.
that episode with those characters. I don't know if you've seen it, but oh, I was sobbing, and so therapeutic in the 50 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes of what that episode was. The work I say I did on myself, the unconscious did on me, and the creators of that show did on me, to settle some inner turbulence about the way I
Mm.
felt about love and loss and grief. And it was so beautiful. And yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting. And I really think your comments there about this kind of acceptance of loss in whatever form it takes in your life is super important, because the nature of the world we live in, like you said, your sort of neuroscience brain is all very in the material, in the matter of fact, and then these piercing events in your personal myth pulled you to see the more ineffable, sort of less tangible, but potent forces
Mm.
that can bring you out of that, to kind of take a person out of this idea that the material kind of brings with it, which is things are finite and things
Yeah.
disappear and they're gone for good, and they're either here or they're not, and it's a thing or it's not a thing. And
Mm.
I'm not telling anyone how to live their life, but I would always say, I'll float the question: be open to the mystery, be open to what it brings. And your story is so beautiful, so well articulated, and it's such, again, I say it again, it's just such a great example of that. And there's so much wisdom in it as well. So I know I'm going to watch this back many times. Um, yeah, because there's so much there. So yeah, Emma,
Mm.
thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. This has been great. Where can people find you, and also what are you doing at the moment that people can engage with you around? Are you doing workshops?
Mm. Oh God, I mean, first of all, thank you. That was a really beautiful weaving together of, but also I really value your personal story. And yeah, I'm grateful that you shared it. So thank you. Um, where can people find me? Well, where can people find me? It's a good question, because I've spent the last few years really in my own little chrysalis, really allowing myself to come undone in order to change the form. So um, it has been difficult for people to find me by design. But so yeah, and so in the future, what I'm doing a lot more writing now. I've really moved into my writing in a much bigger way than I had before. But I can't say too much about what I'm doing in that space, particularly because it's coming into being as we speak. But I do. I have been doing, in fact, I've done this most of my career, but now it's taken a very different flavor. I do a lot of creative coaching, and I've specifically been doing retreats, and very much using actually something that it sounded like you were talking about, but there isn't really a word for it in English. There's an Irish word called dukas, which has no English translation, but it's essentially this idea of belonging and longing, and what you were talking about there between the kind of co-creation between the audience and the creator, that moment of connection. That's kind of what dukas is. It's this idea of like an ancient belonging, but that people can have. It doesn't necessarily mean belonging to a land, or it doesn't necessarily mean about birthright. It can be that you and I belong together when our eternal echoes meet each other and connect. So I find that an amazing foundation on which to explore the creative process, and certainly to unlock creative blocks. And I meet a lot of people who feel unable to access their own creativity. So I do those, and what else? And yeah, I'm doing the TV stuff. But listen, the industry is in an interesting place right now, so it's definitely there's a moment of rupture happening. But listen, sure, isn't that seems to be the flavor du jour, and it's not just the TV industry that's in a bit of distress. So yeah, I'm kind of just embracing the unknown, and just putting one foot in front of the other, just kind of going like, I mean, life's more interesting when I'm not trying to put metrics against everything. So I'm going to keep going with that in mind.
And if people wanted to sort of reach out to kind of, are you on any socials? No judgment if not.
Begrudgingly, I am still on X. This is one thing I can't seem to sever, but so I'm on there. I think it's at Smithwick, SMITHLEWICK. And then also LinkedIn is where a lot of people reach me. So that's quite a good place to start.
Brilliant. Listen, Emma, I appreciate you. You are a fabulous human being. I immediately felt a kindred connection to you, I think, when we studied together. Yeah, you are a source of wisdom, and yeah, it's just been fantastic. So thank you so much. And
thank you, Chris. You're a hell of a gift in my life. So I'm very grateful for you. And thanks for the honor of getting to come on and chat about,
The pleasure is all mine. You're very welcome.
All right. See you soon. Bye.